The echoes of cannon fire had barely faded from the scarred fields of Europe when the world found itself standing at a crossroads. November 1918 marked the end of the Great War, a conflict unlike any before it, a war that had consumed nations, toppled empires, and left millions dead. For many, the armistice was not just a cessation of hostilities, but the promise of a new and lasting peace. Yet, in the uneasy quiet that followed, the seeds of an even greater conflict were already being sown.
The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, sought to shape the post-war world. The victorious Allied powers, chief among them France, Britain, and the United States, gathered to decide the fate of the defeated Central Powers, especially Germany. The treaty's terms were harsh. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, make enormous reparations payments, and surrender significant territories. Its military was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. For many Germans, these terms were not just humiliating, they were unbearable. The wounds of war were kept open by the sense of injustice, and the treaty, intended to guarantee peace, became a source of resentment. Europe itself was transformed. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were dismantled, their lands carved into new nation-states. Russia, consumed by revolution, had withdrawn from the war and emerged as the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. New borders were drawn, often with little regard for the ethnic, cultural, or historical realities on the ground. The map of Europe was redrawn, but many of its new lines were fragile, the peace precarious. In the 1920s, the world tried to return to normalcy. The League of Nations was created, an international body meant to resolve disputes and prevent future wars. Yet the League, lacking the participation of the United States and the ability to enforce its decisions, proved weak from the outset. Old rivalries and new resentments simmered beneath the surface. Germany, crippled by the burden of reparations and economic hardship, spiraled into chaos. The Weimar Republic, the fledgling democratic government established after the war, struggled to maintain stability. Hyperinflation ravaged the economy. By 1923, the German mark was virtually worthless, savings evaporated overnight, and ordinary people were plunged into poverty. Political extremism flourished as faith in democracy faltered. Communists and right-wing nationalists clashed in the streets. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and anger that radical voices began to find an audience. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States experienced the Roaring '20s, a decade of prosperity and cultural dynamism. Yet, the good times would not last. In 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the world into the Great Depression. The economic catastrophe spread rapidly, affecting Europe and beyond. Millions lost their jobs, banks failed, and governments struggled to cope. The Depression deepened the sense of despair and instability that had never truly left since the end of the Great War. In Italy, Benito Mussolini seized on national discontent to rise to power. Promising to restore order and revive Italy's fortunes, he established the first fascist regime in 1922, an authoritarian, nationalist government that glorified the state above the individual and rejected democracy. Mussolini's success inspired others, and the allure of strong, decisive leadership in troubled times began to grow. Germany, still reeling from economic and political turmoil, was particularly vulnerable to such ideas. Into this environment stepped Adolf Hitler, a former soldier and leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Hitler's message was one of grievance and vengeance. He blamed Germany's woes on the Treaty of Versailles, on communists, and, most virulently, on Jews, whom he scapegoated for all manner of national problems. In 1923, Hitler attempted a coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, in Munich. It failed, and he was imprisoned, but he used his trial to broadcast his ideology to a wider audience. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision for Germany's future, the rejection of Versailles, the unification of all Germans, The conquest of living space in the East and the extermination of perceived enemies, the late 1920s and early 1930s were a time of mounting crisis. The Depression hit Germany particularly hard, fueling even greater discontent. The Weimar government was seen as weak and incapable of solving the nation's problems. The Nazis, once a fringe movement, gained traction by promising to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its economy, and provide jobs. In 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to consolidate control. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext to suspend civil liberties and suppress political opponents. The Enabling Act, passed soon after, gave Hitler dictatorial powers. Over the next few years, he dismantled the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic, established a totalitarian regime, and began a campaign of persecution against Jews, communists, and other groups deemed undesirable. Hitler's goals were clear: overturn the Treaty of Versailles, rearm Germany, and expand its territory. The international community watched with growing alarm, but its response was tepid. In 1935, Hitler openly defied Versailles by reintroducing conscription and rebuilding the German military. The League of Nations condemned these actions, but took no effective measures. Britain and France, wary of another war and preoccupied with their own economic troubles, pursued a policy of appeasement, hoping that satisfying some of Hitler's demands would preserve the peace. In March 1936, Hitler further tested the resolve of the Allies by remilitarizing the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles as a buffer between Germany and France. French and British leaders protested, but did not intervene. Hitler's gamble paid off, emboldening him further. Meanwhile, fascism was on the march elsewhere. In Italy, Mussolini sought to revive the glories of the Roman Empire. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few African nations still independent. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they were ineffective. The conquest of Ethiopia gave Mussolini prestige at home and signaled the impotence of international institutions. In Spain, a civil war broke out in 1936 between the leftist Republican government and right-wing nationalists led by General Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini supported Franco with troops, planes, and weapons, while the Soviet Union aided the Republicans. The Western democracies, including Britain and France, largely stayed out. The Spanish Civil War became a testing ground for new weapons and tactics, and a prelude to the wider conflict to come. Back in Germany, Hitler accelerated his plans. In March 1938, he announced the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. German troops marched into Vienna, greeted by cheering crowds. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. The international response was muted. Many in Britain and France accepted Hitler's claim that he was merely uniting German-speaking peoples. But Hitler's ambitions did not stop at Austria. He turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, home to a significant German-speaking minority in the Sudetenland. Claiming that Germans there were mistreated, Hitler demanded the territory's transfer to Germany. As tensions mounted, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich to negotiate with Hitler. The resulting Munich Agreement of September 1938 allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring peace for our time, but the reality was far different. Czechoslovakia was betrayed and left defenseless, and Hitler was convinced that the Western powers lacked the will to stop him. By March 1939, Hitler had broken his promises. German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, making clear that his ambitions extended far beyond unifying German-speaking peoples. The illusion of appeasement as a path to peace was shattered. Amid these events, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, watched warily. Stalin distrusted both Hitler and the Western democracies, and his own regime was marked by purges, repression, and the drive to industrialize and militarize the country. As Hitler's aggression escalated, Britain and France sought an alliance with the USSR, but negotiations faltered amid mutual suspicion. In the spring and summer of 1939, Hitler set his sights on Poland. He demanded the return of Danzig, a free city with a large German population, and the establishment of a corridor connecting East Prussia to the rest of Germany. Poland refused, and Britain and France, recognizing the threat, pledged to guarantee Poland's independence. Then, in a shocking development, Germany and the Soviet Union announced the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, a non-aggression agreement that stunned the world. Secretly, the two regimes agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. The pact cleared the way for Hitler to attack Poland without fear of a Soviet intervention. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Blitzkrieg. Lightning War unleashed a new kind of warfare, combining speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Tanks, planes, and troops smashed through Polish defenses. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The road to this catastrophe was long and complex, shaped by the scars of the First World War and the failures of peace. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to prevent another conflict, had instead sowed bitterness and instability. The Great Depression undermined economies and democracies, giving rise to extremist ideologies. Fascism and totalitarianism spread across Europe, unchecked by weak international institutions and the reluctance of democracies to confront aggression. The interwar years were marked by hope and despair, by the dream of a lasting peace and the reality of mounting tensions. The lessons of the Great War were not forgotten, but they were misunderstood. In their desire to avoid another conflict, the leaders of Britain and France hesitated, compromised, and appeased, hoping that concessions might satisfy the ambitions of dictators. Instead, each concession emboldened them further. Across the world, ordinary people lived through these turbulent times, often unaware of the forces gathering around them. In the cafes of Berlin and Vienna, in the fields of Poland, in the factories of Manchester and Detroit, life went on. Yet the storm clouds gathered. The stage was set for a conflict even more devastating than the one that had come before. September 1939 marked the end of the interwar period and the beginning of a new, terrible chapter in human history. The world would pay a heavy price for the failures and miscalculations of the past 2 decades. But in understanding how the peace of 1918 gave way to the war of 1939, we come closer to grasping the complexities of history and the dangers of forgetting its lessons.